Got it.
Welcome back, Fierce Souls. And this week I am joined by the awesome Jo Renshaw, who is a life coach for men. So, Jo, welcome.
Hello, Jordan. Thank you very much for having me.
It's fantastic to get you on and have a chat.
Fun to
So,
be here.
life coach for men, it's quite a broad title. Share exactly what it is you do.
Yeah, let's narrow it down a bit because there are many, many men, but I do specifically work with men who are feeling stressed and who want to make more money. So often the men that come to work with me, some of them are entrepreneurs and have their own businesses, and they come and tell me, Jo, my business is hemorrhaging money. It's really stressful. Help me. I know you know about money. Because I've been through bankruptcy, so I've come out the other side of that. So that's something that I talk about in my marketing. And when we sort of dig into it, what we find is that business is okay, and this dramatic kind of overview of hemorrhaging money is I mean, 'cause it's a dramatic word, isn't it? Hemorrhaging.
Absolutely. Well, I have the vision of literally, hemorrhaging blood,
Yeah,
just not
yeah,
being able to stop it. So
yeah.
yeah.
So what we do is we kind of go on a fact-finding mission and we find out really where the money's going. And what I've observed is that those clients who have that story are trying to plug all the gaps. They're trying to, um, cut costs here and cut costs there and reduce and make themselves smaller. Now, this is something we hear talked about women doing a lot. We don't hear about it for men quite so much. And while they're essentially trying to make themselves smaller, they're not outselling. So some of the work I help them do helps them just put a stop to that and go out and sell their product. And that's because it's never a money going out problem, right? It's always a money coming in problem because money loves to flow. So we get the dynamic shifted the other way. So that's kind of what people come to me for. But yeah, underneath the sort of presenting problem, if you like, that people come to me is about money. But this stress, this underlying stress that it's causing them, they've got to the point where A, the stress is unbearable, and B, they just don't know what to do about it. And they feel quite ashamed about it because men have been socialized to be the breadwinners, be the strong ones, be the capable ones, be the ones who bring all the money in and have all the answers for that. And they just don't. And so that compounded with, telling themselves they're failing, they're not succeeding, that, even though these men have very happy marriages, happy children, live in lovely homes, it's still not quite good enough. And that comes from the conditioning that they've been under. So what they're missing then is seeing just how amazing their life actually is. Just what incredible impact they've already made on the world. And this is never about sugarcoating anything and going, let's count our blessings, because, if we're feeling stressed, counting your blessings is not something you want to go and do. But it's about turning our attention to the things that are working well, because what we give our attention to sort of grows. So the more if we're giving all our attention to what's not working well, where our life is an absolute disaster, where all our friends are doing better than us, and we're last in the pack, we'll see more of that. If we turn our attention to how well we've already done and what great impact we've made, then we'll see more of that. So yeah, that's some broad brushstrokes of what I do and who I
Wow.
help.
And I'm just so taken by knowing the impact that that sense of not doing enough, and especially when failing actually does become that real impact on income. I mean, obviously I've seen it further down the spectrum in my mental health work,
Yeah.
and that real impact where men in particular can't see a way out.
Yeah.
And actually I was just taken by the men that come to you. That's a huge step for some men, to actually
Really
come and
big.
say, help, I need support.
Yeah. Really big. In fact, one client came to me and he told me that his wife had said to him, why don't you try counseling? And he said, I don't think counseling's what I need. He said, I don't feel like I'm sick, but I feel like I need my head sorting out. So he understood that he wanted some guidance, but it was hard for him to make that step because there were connotations around what counselling and therapy meant. And so, yeah, it's that shame part that I think has stopped some men from seeking that help. So those men that do come and talk to me, it's a very courageous step for them to come and open up about, hey, these things are difficult.
Yeah. And you mentioned in there your own story.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned your own experiences. So how did you get to coaching and coaching men in particular?
All right. So how I got to coaching and how I got to coaching men in particular, it's one long journey actually. So when I was 22, I met a man who was 19 years older than me. And we started a relationship and we had a beautiful daughter who is now a lovely grown-up young woman. And he was a photographer, very successful, incredible business. He'd had a great business in the 80s. But when I met him, business was on a downturn. And he was by then a chronic alcoholic. And he had no other tools to deal with his stress other than a bottle of wine, many bottles of wine some nights. And so I lived with him for 3 years. And after those 3 years, I left our family home and moved from Leicester down here to Brighton. But of course, that relationship didn't end because we had a daughter that we were communicating over. And until she was about 16, it was very fraught because he never stopped drinking. And so when you're dealing with someone that is just living from hangover to hangover, their version of reality is very, very different from your own. So communication was extremely difficult. And what I understand his addiction to be now was a real sort of embodiment of lack for him. So money was tight. It was tighter than it had been for him in the 80s. And so those stories I was talking about earlier, he had all those stories about he'd been through bankruptcy. In fact, I think he might have been through a couple. So there was a sort of bravado about it in that industry, but there was also shame. Yeah. And as a result of that, a story I developed about how poor I was came out of that. So my story was I'd been in this terrible relationship. I'm making air quotes here. And he wasn't able to support me financially after I left him. So there was always a fight for money. And of course, then there was the trope of the single mum having housing benefits and council tax benefits as it was then, income support. And again, while money was tight, I always had a roof over my head and always had food on the table. My daughter never went without. We by no means had a luxurious life, but she was well cared for, and everything she needed, she had, on a physical, practical level. So this sort of led to my bankruptcy. And by the time I went bankrupt in 2013, I had help from local government, national government. I'd had a job, so I had made money myself. My mum and dad had helped me, and I thought, if I've had all this help and I've still gone bankrupt, then surely there has to be another way. And I think the only other way available to me is to think differently about money. Because I hear people like Abraham Hicks, and I'd seen that film The Secret, so I knew a bit about the law of attraction, and I was getting to grips with this idea that what we think about comes about, and we create our own reality, and that those ideas interested me. And I thought, well, everything I've done hasn't worked. Let's see if thinking differently works. I've got nothing else to lose. The worst has already happened. I've gone bankrupt. So in the UK, when you're bankrupt, you have 6 years on the insolvency register. And during that time, you're not allowed to have any credit or an overdraft. So I had to start making exactly enough money to pay the rent and bills every month. And by then, my daughter, I think she'd just left college, so she was beginning to work. So any child-related benefits that we'd had as a family went, and I think I lost about £600 overnight.
Wow.
Because there was a portion for her as a school child, for my rent, and there was a portion for my income. So she went to work and I had to go to work, and she was amazing. She started paying rent as soon as she was working. I think she paid £25 a week. I wanted her to have that discipline, to learn that discipline straight away, that there's a bill coming. And at that time, I was a freelance producer in photography. I just graduated from a degree at the University of Brighton in photography. So jobs started coming in as I started turning my attention to more and more to how am I going to make money? I need to make money rather than how am I going to shrink down?
Yeah.
So I found over those few years, money, it just magically always seemed to be enough. I never went without. I was able to live without an overdraft, without credit cards. And I had this date on my diary of, I think it was about the 11th of December, 2019, when I would come off the insolvency register. And that was a date I was aiming for because I wanted by then to feel so secure in my ability to manage my money well, because the story had always been Jo's so bad with money.
Yeah.
And that the next day, when credit was available to me, suddenly, because your credit record goes back to what it was when you were 18 years old, when you come off the insolvency register. So you have this brand new, fresh virgin credit. And I did not want to go to December the 12th and be like, right, let's get a credit card. Let's build up those debts again. I wanted to feel really secure in myself. And a few days after that date, I then worked for Lush as a retail assistant. And I walked down the stairs in my building, picked up a Christmas card on my way to a Christmas shift in Lush, and opened it as I was crossing the road here. And inside was a check for £50,000. And I thought, oh my God, I've done it. And the check was dated the day after I came off the insolvency register. So I knew then that everything I'd done had worked. So it was sort of from that point on that then I had to integrate all that learning and take on the identity of someone who did know how to make and have and steward a lot of money. So just going back to men, because this is still pertinent, I started coaching. Of course, then we came into 2020. And the whole world changed, everything changed. So I was put on furlough from my job at Lush and started my business in March 2020. And business was going really well. I had kind of half men, half women clients, and I was doing general life coaching. And then in November 2021, last year, my daughter's father passed away. So my work this year has been very much recovering from that, grieving for that, going through that process of stewarding him and his life through to the other side, and really seeing him and his struggles in a different way. And where we were at peace when he died. We had been for a few years, which I'm so grateful for. But what seemed so desperate and terrible to me in my young 20s, I now have such a different understanding that he was actually in a great deal of pain and he had nowhere to go for it other than the bottle. And so it feels really important to me that if I can help even one man not have as much pain as he did, then his life won't have been in vain.
And that's just, I mean, there's so many wow moments in that story. I think I'm sat here with goosebumps. But I think all of that is just so pertinent. I know that I specialize in coaching women, but I also have a real interest in veterans, you know, coming from a forces family. And again, so many of them come from that place of shame, of man up, deal with it. You know, finding, as you've said, trying to find the release or the numbness or whatever it is they're looking for, whether it's the bottle or the drugs, or and just being in that cycle, because once you're in it, getting out of it is, you know, not just takes double the effort, it takes about 4 times the effort.
Absolutely.
Because of releasing the addiction and then working through what was there originally, because that hasn't gone anywhere. So and
it's devastating effects for not just the person with the addiction and not just the man who's dealing with his own issues, but for the people around him as well.
Absolutely. And but that is with so much of what we do, I think, as coaches, whether there is an addiction there or not, if that person is struggling, however much pain they're in, or emotional stress or distress, that the knock-on effects for everybody. So once that starts to change, it's that ripple effect. And the knock-ons. Go on.
One of those addictions I see that is it's sort of glorified in our culture is overwork. And a lot of the men that come and talk to me have come from the kind of background where they were trained to work hard. Probably the same with veterans as well. They're trained to work hard. And I know this through my bankruptcy. I know that it wasn't doing things and working hard that was solving my problems. I know now it was thinking about things differently. So for these men I work with, one of the things we do is decondition that idea that they have to work hard to make more money. And it's at the expense of their physical and emotional well-being.
And I don't know if it's also like women, but quite often the worth is connected to the working hard as well. Actually, I was reflecting on this the other day, that coming from local authority, you were always seen as more valuable, I guess. Obviously, if you got your work done, but getting the work done quite often meant working weekends, quite often actually meant working 60-hour weeks, putting a lot of yourself into it, which is great for the families and the young people you're working with. I mean, absolutely, they deserve all of that, but not so great for the worker and the person. But actually, if you were behind and you weren't putting the extra effort and you weren't putting the hours in, you weren't seen as valuable.
Oh, interesting.
So I was just wondering if there was a crossover as well into their value, that if they weren't working as hard.
Yeah, totally. Well, I interviewed one man to bring into my practice recently, and he was working from 8 o'clock in the morning till midnight every night and taking 2 half-hour breaks. And he told me that he was doing this in part because he felt that there was nothing he could do to prove himself to his boss. Like nothing he ever did was good enough. And so he was working harder and more to show his boss how valuable he was. But it actually wasn't having an impact at all. And he said to me, I have to keep doing this, and it might be for another 18 years when I retire. And that really broke my heart, that he was considering, or he was willing to do that, to collect his retirement.
Yeah.
And if for any men listening, and any women listening who see that in men around them, that's your connection with your children, your connection with your partner, your connection with your physical well-being is not going to wait for 20 years. It needs you now.
Yeah. I had a very personal example come to mind as you were talking, because I think my brother is absolutely wonderful, but he is definitely one of those people that works all the hours
Right.
to bring in the money. So
Yeah.
Jo, just stepping back, there were a couple of stories came up as you were talking before. So one of them that actually I should have said at the beginning and completely forgot. You talked about November last year, but just before, about a month before that, in the October 21, is when you and I actually connected. Randomly, in some sense, although I don't believe in random, that we were both on a weekend call with Susan Hyatt, the coach, and her Finish Strong weekend. And I realized there was this other English person actually on the Zoom, because most of the other women were America and Canada. And looked up your Instagram, and my sense was, I recognize those beach huts. Where are you? And then meeting for coffee, because we realized we were about 10 minutes down the road from each other.
It's one of the I know COVID has had some enormous and not so beneficial effects for so many people, but one of the amazing things was that Zoom kind of made the world smaller in a way, and was able to put us in places and spaces with people we might never have come into contact with. So Susan Hyatt, this coach in the States who you and I have both followed for some time, extended her event to have a virtual space as well. So she had some, by then I think there were some people back in person and some people virtually. So for me, it was really fun to find you literally just down the road and have someone else that I can sit over coffee with and talk about, geek out over coaching.
I love that. Yes, we definitely geek out over coaching. Well, and actually, off the back of that, the last time we geeked out was less about coaching and more about, and I still want to hear so much more about this, your amazing trip that you had wanted to do for a long time. And I know you shared with your beautiful daughter, or at least part of it. So tell us about your experience.
This is another shared passion that you and I have for New York.
Definitely, yes.
So I, at the end of September, had 2 weeks in New York. It was a trip that had been planned for a long time. My daughter turned 25 a week after her father died, and I had given her a trip to New York for her 25th birthday. And we obviously had to postpone that trip, and then we postponed it again because of Omicron, and then the year kind of went by. And I work with another coach in the States, and she suddenly announced she was putting on a 3-day event in New York. So I said to my daughter, let's combine the two things. Let's go, I'll go and do this 3-day event, and then we'll have your birthday trip as well. And part of the purpose also was to honor her dad, who made a lot of work there in the 90s. So he was commissioned by Saatchi to make all sorts of pieces, and New York was his favorite place on earth. And he said to me many times, I'll take you there one day. And my daughter and I felt like he got us there eventually. So one of the first things we did when she arrived was to go to places that he made work and see those images that we'd known so well for the last 25 years, see the places where he stood and stand in those spots. So that was very beautiful and very moving. And for me to have time with her there was just an absolute delight. So we did her dad really educated her very well about art, and he introduced her to all that. I'm just sitting here looking at his book collection in my study. So he introduced her to all the great painters like Cézanne, Picasso, Van Gogh, and all her life she'd wanted to see Starry Night. And we went to see that in the MoMA. And again, a very beautiful moment. But when we went to the Met, it was like just an abundance of riches. We would turn a corner and there's Van Gogh, and then there's Cézanne, and there's Monet and Degas. So it was lovely to spend time walking through Central Park, soaking up art, and yeah, hanging out together. But what an exciting city.
Absolutely. There is just so much going on. Well, I was going to say you got to see the whole
Yeah.
uh, the whole variety on available. And I think the one thing about New York, actually, given we've been talking about making money and, you know, from bankruptcy to abundance, and I think I know our cities in the UK have it, but there is something about New York where it's almost so much more vivid.
Yeah,
That you literally see every bit of that spectrum.
totally. I mean, first of all, to step off an airplane and walk into New York, which is kind of one of the world centers of finance, less than 10 years after going bankrupt, blows my mind. I could never have imagined 10 years ago that I would get to the USA, and I've wanted to go to the States for all of my life. So that part, just seeing myself in that new sort of self-concept, if you like, that here I am in, as the line says in the Hamilton show, in the greatest city on earth. Yeah. And it really felt like that. It really felt like New York knows itself well. It knows it is the greatest city on the earth. It knows that it has so much to offer. It has, as you say, the full spectrum of, you know, poverty to utter riches. What I loved was that it seems to, it values itself. So it's clean, it's well cared for, it's well organized. You can access services really easily. It was intense. We live in a seaside town, which is busy but much calmer. Yeah. And so it was intense to be there for 2 weeks. So getting into Central Park to have downtime was really necessary. But that's available. No, we didn't have to be. And here, you know, is another kind of connection to talking about those men that are working so hard all the time. We didn't have to be at Times Square all the time. We could get into more peaceful places and have that downtime. And there's a recharge from being around the noise and the lights and the excitement and that visceral kind of energy. Watching the first night of the Met Opera broadcast live in Times Square was just thrilling. It's just things you hear about in movies. So we felt like we were in a movie.
Well, and you talking about, you know, those 10 years in your journey reminded me that the first time I went to New York, so I was 19, I'd been out doing, you know, camp in America. I was literally living on $10 a day because that's all I had left.
Oh, wow.
So anything that I did had to be cheap or worked out. So I was staying in a hostel. Around the corner there was somewhere you could get, you know, like ham and eggs or whatever it might have been for a few dollars. So that was brunch. And then it was, you know, like spending a day in Central Park or going to one of the museums because that didn't cost anything. Sitting at the Lincoln Center and watching this fabulous dance show. We went clubbing a couple of times, but the hostel staff very kindly don't know what word I was about to come out with then, chose to go without their lunch and actually paid for us to get in to the clubs. So my first experience of New York was done literally on that shoestring.
Wow.
And yes, I had all these opportunities. And then my most recent experience was booking 2 or 3 days before I flew out, running away for New Year because things had gone wrong over Christmas.
Yeah.
Turning left on the airplane when I got on board for the first time ever. Booking a hotel in Times Square, as you said, being there for New Year.
Oh, wow.
You know, doing Top of the Rock, jumping on and off the buses, getting down and doing the few things that I hadn't done before. And absolutely having that complete, not necessarily opposite experience, because I still went into Central Park and walked and did those things. But I guess without having to think so much about the money. The first time was very much, if I buy this, it means I can't do that.
Right.
Or, you know, how am I going to make my money stretch? I've still got to eat.
Yeah.
Whereas this time was very much, I want to do it. Here you go. Just put, you know,
nice.
There's the card.
Yeah.
So it was very interesting seeing both sides and the experience of both sides.
And I think that's still very true. And for the every other area of our life, is that we don't need money to have an amazing, rich experience.
Yeah.
So those museums and art galleries that you can go into to for free, you know, if your priority is to eat for the day, which mine usually is, and if money's no object, if you have tons and tons of it, no problem. You can get all the taxis and pay for all the events and all the food. But if you but don't not go and do something because you don't think you have the money, because there's always a way that you can enjoy a rich life without having money. And that was one of the things that really helped me in my transition from bankruptcy to having money. I learned to see how rich and wealthy my life already was. I mean, just by living by the sea. Excuse me. Just living by the sea. That I grew up in the Midlands. To go to the seaside was a family holiday, and it was a treat. And to now, as a grown-up, to live by the sea and walk along the seafront every day, I mean, that feels like, where are the adults? Do they know this is going on? And I don't need any money to do that.
No, I mean, it was more than a treat. My luxurious day off when I was employed was buying a coffee, taking my book or my journal and sitting on the seafront on a really nice sunny day. You know, on a weekday when that sense of, oh, I should be at work, but I've got a day off, and just sitting there. And okay, it cost me a coffee, but I could have taken that if I didn't have, even if I didn't have that money, you could have made it at home and taken it with you.
Yeah.
So, and I love that you talked about, you know, living that rich life without the money. And I think it's the other way as well, which is taking in everything. It's going back exactly to what you said at the beginning of how you work with the men, of seeing what you do have, of appreciating those experiences.
Yeah.
Being able to, even if you do have the money to drop on everything, actually that day you walk along the seafront, seeing how special that is, and really taking all of that in, not just thinking on to the next thing, or thinking, oh, well, if I'd spent more, or whatever those thoughts might be.
Yeah. And moving on then from that as well, I think what happens, and certainly what happened for me, is that as I got secure in my rich life, even though I didn't have a huge amount of money, I just had enough each month. It was when I didn't need it anymore that more came. I wasn't having to chase it. I'd already created that sort of abundance and sufficiency for myself. And that's what I see in my clients as well. When they stop hoarding what they've got, or shrinking and holding themselves back, when they create sufficiency for themselves through a practice of rest and appreciation and, you know, speaking kindly to themselves, when they build this abundant relationship for themselves, then money starts to flow much more easily.
I'm glad you dropped rest in there, because I think obviously when I do my work, I talk quite often about those feminine energies and masculine energies, and it's a very obviously masculine energy to hustle, work harder, keep going. All of those guys that don't need the rest, it's like, well, I'll do this and then I'll go to the gym and it's fine, I can cope on 5 hours.
Yeah.
And actually, how much more we all get done with that rest. That time out is more than acceptable.
Yeah, and makes us more productive later. As well.
I know there is so much more that you and I can talk about, but you've mentioned how you work with men and what that work is. How can people get in touch with you if they would like more information on working
They can come and find me on LinkedIn. So it's linkedin.com/Jo Renshaw, or on Instagram, and it's instagram.com Jo_Renshaw.
We will get your links dropped into the show notes.
Fab, thank you. And I have a weekly newsletter that I send out to my list, where I share a story about something that I've done in my life that's helped me, or I share a story from my client that's helped them. And on my website, I also have a sort of hidden page for subscribers that's got a tool called the Life Audit, where they can take themselves through an exercise to see where they're at and figure out where they'd like to go. And there are some audio classes on there of masterclasses I've taught in the past. So yeah, that's how they can get hold of me.
Amazing. We have done a lot of talking, but is there anything else that you would like to share, or anything burning you feel that you would wanted to say?
Yeah, what I would like to share is this month, in the month of November, I've got a goal to invite 100 men to come and have a taster session, a life coaching taster session with me. And I'm going to put a link to that on Instagram. There's something called a link tree, which has various links, and they'll find it on there. So it's a 60-minute session to come and find out. So many men have never tried life coaching before, and I would like to share that with them so they can find out what is it that goes on in a life coaching session.
Amazing. 100, that is a lot of space and a lot of experiences.
Yeah, and I'm excited to meet lots of people as well.
Yeah. And I guess I would just add on to that, that for any women listening, if they've got any men in their lives, whether that be partners, brothers, parents,
yeah, absolutely,
to pass this over and
yes, please,
open those opportunities up.
Yeah, and also just to consider, if the men in your life are being stressed, it's not because they're dicks. It's because they have stuff going on. And we all know sometimes men are dicks and sometimes women are dicks as well.
Yeah.
But there's always something else going on. And I think that in women's circles, we often talk about patriarchy and how damaging it is to women and society. It damages men just as much. And patriarchy isn't only upheld by men. It's a system that lives within human beings. It's just that it might appear more visible in men. So yeah, that would be my plea, if you like, to women, that it's the difficulties in the world is not all the fault of men.
And as you were talking, I was reminded actually of another colleague, when she was struggling in her relationship with her husband, and exactly the same as the work that I do with women, men have the same patterns, men have the same upbringing in childhood. They have the same patterns to break. So
Yeah.
if they've learned that work hard,
Yeah.
not only does it come from the patriarchal society, but actually it comes from family lines, it comes
Yeah.
from ancestral, and it's understanding and recognizing this is so much bigger than one
Yeah.
person. So just
Yeah.
as women need to break their own cycles and sometimes their ancestral lines,
Yeah.
it's the same with men as well.
Totally. Yeah.
And
Totally.
having that compassion and having that understanding
Yeah.
that if this is the way they were brought up,
Mm-hmm.
they've got a lot to relearn.
Yeah.
To be able to be in a different space.
Yeah. Yeah. It's seeing things through different lenses.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Jo, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on, Jordan. It's been really great to talk to you.
No problem. And thank you all for listening.